Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Rubenstein. It's March 2nd, 2025, and this is the live daily briefing of the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office. Big news. The Prime Minister of Israel announced that Israel will halt the shipment of food and supplies to the Hamas government of Gaza until the Hamas government of Gaza releases the hostages that the Hamas government of Gaza has been torturing and starving for nearly 17 months. The Prime Minister's office said in a statement that Israel will not allow a ceasefire without the release of our hostages. If Hamas persists in its refusal, there will be additional consequences. I see the headlines already. Israel blocks entry of all humanitarian aid into Gaza. We should stop referring to the shipments of food and supplies to the Hamas terrorist army as humanitarian aid. It's not humanitarian aid when Hamas hoards it, taxes it, and uses the revenue from the taxes to pay its fighters, recruit more men and boys, and prolong the war. It's a crazy situation. We know that the food in Gaza that Hamas hoards is not reaching the hostages. Hamas is starving the hostages. Hamas refuses to feed the hostages that it has held for nearly 17 months. Hamas sees the hostages as an asset. It's time that Hamas starts to see the hostages as a liability and releases them. The United States and Israel are looking for a path forward out of the impasse. The United States has proposed a framework for a temporary Ramadan and Passover ceasefire. It calls for half of the living and murdered hostages to be released on day one, and the rest once an agreement on a permanent ceasefire is reached. The American framework is called the Witkoff Framework, after President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff. The Hamas terror regime in Gaza has, not surprisingly, rejected the Witkoff framework to extend the ceasefire and the hostage ransom payments. Here's the big picture of where we are now. The ceasefire has expired. Phase 1 of the hostage ransom payment is complete. During Phase 1, Hamas released a total of 33 living and dead Israeli hostages in exchange for the release of over 1,000 Palestinian terrorists and Gazans who were detained after October 7th, and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from almost all of Gaza. Right now, with Phase 1 completed, Hamas remains the government of Gaza. Hamas can exert control in every city of Gaza. Hamas controls the food supply in Gaza. Hamas has already launched rockets, and it is testing Israel's border defenses. We are not at Phase 2 of the hostage ransom payment, and we may never reach Phase 2. That's why the American Witkoff framework is so important. The problem with Phase 2 of the hostage ransom payment is that it calls for Israel's full withdrawal from Gaza, including the Philadelphia corridor on the Gaza-Egypt border, in exchange for the release of the remaining hostages, most of whom are male Israeli soldiers. If Israel withdraws its forces from all of Gaza and ends the war, then Hamas will remain the government of Gaza, and we will be back to where we were on October 6th, 2023. This is a non-starter. It's going to take some creative diplomacy to get out of this one, or more intense Israeli military action in Gaza than we have seen until this point. Let's take some questions from people watching live on social media.
Thank you, Daniel. Our first question comes from Katie on YouTube. Is it against international law for Israel to stop sending food and supplies into Gaza?
Yes, I see this point made everywhere now. I've been on Twitter today. Everyone who hates Israel from the beginning is finding new arguments to use, and this one is that it's completely against international law for Israel to do what it's doing. The Israeli officials estimate that Gaza has 5 months of food and supplies in storage already. An enormous amount of food and supplies have gone into Gaza in recent weeks during phase one of the hostage ransom payment. We're talking 4,200 trucks a week have gone into Gaza. Now, specifically, the question was about international law. If you're at your computer, open your phone, go to Google, Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 23, read the whole thing. It says that free passage of food and supplies is not required if there is serious reason to fear that the food and supplies will be diverted and will be used to strengthen the military and the economy of the enemy. I think it's safe to assume that all of the food and supplies that Israel has sent into Gaza has been diverted and is being used by the enemy to strengthen itself and its own financial situation.
Thank you, Daniel. Our next question comes from Sue Rudov on Instagram. Why did Israel start sending food to Gaza in the first place? Seems like a bit of a double standard that we'd be supplying the enemy.
Israel was very clear in the earliest days of this war that Israel's war is against Hamas and not the people of Gaza. Of course, everyone in Hamas is a person of Gaza and they dress exactly the same. So it's very hard for outsiders to distinguish who is in Hamas and who is a person of Gaza. But Israel's policy was very clear, and it remains very clear that we must distinguish between combatants, between the terrorists in Hamas and the non-combatants. At the same time, Egypt did not open its borders to people who wanted to leave and find some safety outside of the war that Hamas started, and Israel was forced to deal with a situation where enemy civilians were not able to flee. That led to Israel trying to do its best to send as much aid as possible to the civilian population. But Hamas took this aid, hoarded this aid, used this aid to fund its fighters, to control the economy of Gaza, and it strengthened Hamas. Another reason that Israel was eager to send as much food as possible into Gaza was in the hope that that food would reach the hostages that Hamas is holding in its underground dungeons. We've seen from released hostages that the food is not reaching them. The hostages are being starved and tortured. The food is not reaching them. It should have been reaching them. I hope that Hamas gets the message that Hamas needs to release the hostages immediately, and everyone amplifies this message.
Thank you, Daniel. Our next question comes from Asher on Twitter. What's the current status of, what is Israel's current policy towards Syria?
The situation in Syria is changing dramatically, even in recent days. In the beginning, Syria was one of the 7 fronts that Israel was facing. There were Iranian militia, Iranians themselves inside Syria who were using Syria as a base for launching attacks into Israel, such as drones. So Syria has been one of the fronts. A number of months ago, the regime in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, lost power and was replaced by an organization that is comprised of offshoots of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Muslim Brotherhood, and Israel has a lot of questions about what this new government intends for Israel and what other armed groups in Syria may mean if they approach the Israeli border. So Israel has been clear that these armed groups, including from the new central government, must stay far away from the Israeli border. Israel has recently announced that it will protect the Druze population in southern Syria from violence from the new central government that is comprised of offshoots of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Muslim Brotherhood types. It's a very interesting situation where Israel has tried to establish positive relationships inside Syria to keep the Iranian regime and its proxies far away, to keep the ISIS and Al-Qaeda types far away. Israel is going to do what it must do. We're not going to return to an October 6th reality where we wait for groups who want to destroy us to mobilize on our border.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Our final question comes from Twitter. Where can people learn the history of Israel? Do you have any resources that you would point them to understand this conflict better? Anything else you want to share?
There's a few things. First, if you go to my website, which is rubyguidesisrael.com, R-U-B-Y, guidesisrael.com, you click on reading. I have a recommended reading list for people who want to learn more about Israel and its people and the conflict and related subjects, so you can start with that list. The other thing that I would do is read Israeli newspapers, all of them that you can find in English, whether the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, Ynet, Israel Hayom, Haaretz. You need to expose yourself to a diverse array of views in Israel, and also use social media wisely. Look for people who are experts with all kinds of different perspectives, follow them at once, and your newsfeed will be much more informative and educational, and you'll get an idea of what other people believe and what they're sharing. And I think that's a good way to start. But in one word, you have to read. So if you want to do the reading, go to my website, rubyguidesisrael.com, click on reading. You'll find my suggested reading list. If you read any of the books on there, let me know how you thought they were. That's all the time we have for today. This has been a live daily briefing of the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office. We will be back tomorrow at 3 p.m. local time. That's 8 a.m. on the East Coast of the US. Have a lovely day.